The new book, Reassessing Mandela, offers a counterbalance to the many perspectives on Nelson Mandela. It sets out to explore established biographies, re-evaluate different facets of Mandela's life and political ideology, and also reflect on his enduring legacy. It closely examines his family background, his early years, and Thembu ancestry. We're now joined by the authors, historians Willam, Beinart and Colin, Bundy. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, many books have been written about South Africa's first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela. We know him to be celebrated not only here in Africa, but across the world. What made you write this book, Reassessing Mandela?
Shall I take off, William?
Please.
This book actually grew out of a small conference that we held in Oxford in July 2018. That is the centenary year and month of Madiba's birth. And it was an attempt to take stock. It seemed an appropriate moment to reflect on the life and the legacy and also the reputation of an extraordinary leader. And when we held that gathering, I think we were all aware of the way that there had been a kind of sea change in the popular view of Mandela in South Africa. That while the old man was still alive, public criticism of him was very rare. But after 2013, and especially after 2015, the year of the fallist movement, critiques of Mandela were being increasingly heard in the media, on the airways, on the streets, and especially on campuses. And a kind of counter-narrative grew up that was hostile to the old view of Mandela as a national leader, as a nation builder, and as a giant of reconciliation and justice. And this narrative saw Mandela as a sellout, as somebody who had betrayed Black South Africans in the 1994 negotiations because he was too careful to meet white fears. And so it was with somewhere between those, on the one hand, an older view of Mandela as being almost beyond critique, as being this moral and political giant who brooked no criticism, and on the other hand, this view of Mandela as somebody who had grievously sold out in 1994. And I think, to put it very, very briefly, the book does demonstrate quite clearly that neither of those views is correct. They're both bad history. The view that he single-handedly achieved democracy is as poor an historical account as the view that he personally sold out.
Yeah, and I'd like you to come in there, Professor Willam, to just, reiterate on that and echo on that, whether saint or sellout, that it's not black and white when it comes to this kind of a history, and it does an injustice to history, as Professor Bundy was saying there, that it's bad history. How did you then find that balance, Professor Willam, to be able to incorporate, yes, the so-called sellout part, if that may be, a lack of a better word, or the saint part?
Well, I think that the first thing is to establish his extraordinary life and the sacrifice that he made for his political ideals, for his commitment to rights and to freedom in South Africa, to liberation and to democracy, important to add that, and I think to non-racialism. And that capacity to sacrifice cemented his leadership in so many ways. He had authority from that because he was respected in the ANC as a leader, in MK, and then in prison. I think he did play a critical role in bringing people together, not only white and black, during the years after he came out of prison, 1990 to 1999, but also he had to negotiate with Buthelezi in the IFP and bring them in And there were also divisions within the ANC itself, the exiles and the UDF, the different branches of the tripartite alliance. And for me, that cements, in a way, the ICOD. It was an achievement. We can't expect that it would have just happened. South Africa was, in many ways, on the edge. What we need then to do to explore the critique is to go back, I think, to the 1994 settlement and to his 5 years in government, one term only. He knew that an old man had to resign after one term. And I think that that's where we might begin to see some of the roots of the critique.
It's quite ironic that, you know, the roots of the critique will come from him also being quite wise enough to say one term is enough. And as you're saying, Prof, for an old man, he wasn't that young by that time anyway. But moving from this figure who's beyond critique to this figure who is being lambasted by the youth of his country, when we're talking about that fallist period that Professor Colin was referring to earlier. Professor Colin, can you actually then track it, that this is actually when this narrative started to gain traction?
Yes, there was early voicings, some of which emerged at the moment of his death. Zakes reported in an obituary which was very different from the reverential tone that most obituaries had. He identified then, he said there's a strong groundswell, and particularly, he said, on the campuses, which were the EFF's stomping ground, hostile to Mandela. And it was a good prediction. It was a prescient remark by somebody writing in December 2013.
Prof. Bundy, what would you say are part of the problem with idolizing our leaders, no matter how much good they may have done?
I suppose the problem, I don't think there's anything wrong with popular support and even popular affection for a leader. And I think one of the things that is remarkable about Mandela was the extent of admiration and affection that he could engender. South Africans didn't know him, but they loved him. And I think that's a very distinctive feature of his career. I think the danger comes when you move away from the actual person, the man or woman that we're talking about, and the myth that develops around them. And there's absolutely no question that they developed an enormous Mandela myth. You spoke about the international dimensions of it. Just think of all of the adulation that he commanded and his enjoyment of it. The photo calls with everybody from the Spice Girls to Muhammad Ali to world leaders to beautiful women and so on. And they developed a kind of popular version of Mandela, which was of this giant figure, which had increasingly, the more that you blew him up to gigantic proportions, the less in touch you were with the actual man, his characteristics, his abilities, and his shortcomings.
Mm. And Professor Beinart, just touching off that, some of those shortcomings as well, and the Mandela myth, as Professor Bundy has just mentioned as well. What were some of those shortcomings that you were able to highlight in the book and the Mandela myths?
Well, I'd like perhaps to take a step further and to talk about policies. One of the key areas of critique was the entrenchment in the Constitution of property rights. And the Constitution in this new critique became seen as an impediment to more radical social transformation in South Africa and to inequality. We know that South Africa continued unequal. I'm not sure that this is entirely justified. I mean, we could take, for example, one of the very first acts that the new South Africa passed was the Land Restitution Act in 1994. And in many ways, it was a radical act. It was an act which provided the means for some communities who'd been forcibly removed to get their land back. For me, the problem was not so much that the policy wasn't there, but that it was not quickly implemented. And I would say that if I were to make a comment about Mandela, I'm reluctant to be critical that he was not a great hands-on administrator. If the government could have finished land restitution in 10 years, even less, that would have made a big difference. In fact, there's still thousands of cases unresolved, and say District 6 is still pretty much empty of its former population. So for me, perhaps it's the roots in, even in his period, although it got much worse under President Zuma, of the lack of capacity to implement.
Would you say that, that being said, when we're talking about policy as well, Professor Beinart, that, you know, the shortcomings of the governing party, the ANC, post the Mandela tenure of presidency is what actually shot them in the foot, and sometimes it also may appear as if the source of that problem may have been Nelson Mandela himself, but if the policy was there and the implementation was supposed to be have done post his tenure, is it then even fair to even label him as part of the problem when it comes to the land question?
That's a really interesting point to ask, and I do think that there's quite a bit of substance in it. There were a number, very quickly within the first 5 years, 94 to 99, there were a number of radical acts were passed, trade union legislation, protecting workers, the Employment Equity Act, grants, very important, pensions, and the child support grant. These were all put in place. Housing, the number of houses, the expansion of it, all of these things did happen quite quickly initially. And in some ways, I feel you've hit the nail on the head, that it's the lack of implementation later, after quite a quick start, that seems to have been, that it's that critique that gets put back onto Mandela. Although he is, as Colin Bundy mentioned, also seen to have not demanded enough from South Africa's apartheid rulers.
Well, professors, I must tell you, I'm looking forward to getting my hands on that book. Thank you so much for this discussion. Really, really enjoyed that.